In a rooftop bar above Chicago, after a charity gala had emptied into the night, Ryan Carter turned to leave when he noticed a woman alone by the glass, her wheelchair catching the amber light of the skyline. Something in her stillness stopped his steps. Without thinking, he said words that would haunt him for weeks, that she was too pretty to be alone. Madison Reed did not smile. She looked at him and said beauty only made people pity her legs longer. Behind that answer waited a betrayal, a hidden accident, and a silence nobody had dared to break. If that answer already caught your attention, stay close, because the truth waiting at the end will break something open. The gala had been held on the top floor of a glass hotel overlooking the Chicago River. One of those nights the city dressed itself up for a cause everyone claimed to care about. The evening had raised money for programs that helped people with disabilities move through a world that was rarely built for them, and Madison Reed had been the reason half the room had shown up at all. She was the CEO of Reed Mobility, a technology company that built smart devices to help people regain the freedom of movement they had lost, and she had built it from nothing after her father passed the torch to her. She was beautiful in the way photographs loved: sharp cheekbones, a composed mouth, dark hair swept back, and a wheelchair she refused to hide behind a table skirt the way event planners always suggested. After her speech, the crowd had swarmed her the way crowds always did, not with questions about the company or the technology, but with soft voices and softer eyes, the kind of attention that always circled back to her legs instead of her mind. Reporters wanted a quote about resilience. Donors wanted a photograph beside her chair, as if proximity to her struggle proved something about their own decency. Madison smiled through all of it, because smiling was easier than correcting a room full of strangers who thought pity was the same thing as respect. Ryan Carter had not been invited as a guest. He ran a small repair shop that serviced mobility equipment, wheelchairs, lift systems, adapted vehicles, and he had been hired for the evening to inspect the ramp access installed for the event, making sure nothing would embarrass the hotel or, worse, injure someone. He wore a plain jacket that did not match the room, and he moved along the edges of the crowd with a toolbox slung over one shoulder, invisible to almost everyone except the staff who needed him. He noticed Madison the way a person notices something quietly out of place. Not because of the chair, but because of how alone she looked the moment the cameras turned away. The crowd that had surrounded her all night thinned out fast once the champagne ran low, and within 20 minutes she was sitting by herself near the floor-to-ceiling windows of the rooftop bar, watching the city lights instead of the room behind her. Ryan finished his inspection near midnight and should have left through the service elevator. Instead, he found himself crossing the room toward the window, drawn by something he could not entirely name, maybe the stillness of her posture, maybe the way she looked like she was bracing for one more person to say something well-meaning and empty. He stopped a few feet away and said the first thing that came to him, low and a little awkward, that she was too pretty to be alone tonight. Madison did not turn her head right away. When she finally did, there was no warmth in her expression, only a tired, practiced patience, the look of someone who had heard every version of that sentence before. She told him that beauty did not fix anything, that it only made people feel sorrier for her legs a little longer before they walked away. Ryan felt the words land somewhere he had not expected. A quiet accusation folded inside a simple sentence. He opened his mouth to apologize, but she was already reaching for the wheels of her chair, turning from the window, leaving him standing there with the skyline and the sudden understanding that he had touched something far deeper than he intended. He stood there a moment longer than the situation called for, replaying the exchange, wondering how a sentence meant as a small kindness had landed, instead like an old wound reopened. The bar had nearly emptied around him, staff clearing glasses in the low light, and still he lingered near the window, unable to shake the feeling that the woman who had just left carried far more weight than the polished company profile suggested. Something about her answer had not sounded like bitterness so much as exhaustion, the tone of someone who had repeated the same correction so many times it no longer needed anger behind it. The following morning, Ryan drove to the headquarters of Reed Mobility, a glass tower on the edge of the medical district lined with displays of the very devices that had made Madison's company famous: sleek exoskeletons, adaptive wheelchairs, walking frames that folded into something the size of a briefcase. He had found a keycard on the floor near the window the night before, dropped in Madison's hurry to leave, and something about the scratches on its back had bothered him enough that he wanted to return it in person rather than mail it to a company address. The receptionist at the front desk looked him over with the kind of polite dismissal reserved for people who clearly did not belong among glass walls and expensive furniture. His jacket was the same one from the gala, plain and a little worn at the cuffs, and she assumed correctly that he fixed things for a living rather than owned the building he stood in. She asked him twice if he was certain he had the right office before finally agreeing to call up to the executive floor. Madison came down herself, which surprised the receptionist more than it surprised Ryan. She accepted the card without much expression, thanked him in a clipped voice, and turned as though the conversation had already ended. Ryan did not let it end there. He said he owed her an apology for the night before, that he had not meant to pity her or flirt with her carelessly, only to say something honest badly. Madison told him that men always claimed they meant nothing by it, but she was the one left carrying the sting regardless of intention. Ryan did not argue the point. Instead, he said quietly that he understood what it felt like to be defined by a single loss, to have people look at him and see only the shape of what he no longer had rather than the person standing in front of them. Something in her expression shifted just slightly before she caught herself and pulled the cool composure back into place like a door closing. That was when Jason Walker appeared from a side hallway, smooth and unhurried, greeting Ryan with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He reminded Madison with exaggerated patience that the board was waiting and that she should not be delayed by strangers wandering the lobby. Ryan caught the way Jason's gaze moved over him, cataloging his clothes, his toolbox, deciding within seconds that he was beneath notice. As Madison turned to leave, Ryan's attention dropped instinctively to the wheels of her chair, and he heard it, a faint, uneven friction that did not belong there, a sound his years repairing mobility equipment had trained him to catch instantly. It was not the ordinary wear of daily use. It was the specific, telltale grind of an axle that had been deliberately misaligned. He said as much carefully, expecting to be dismissed. Madison did not take it well. She told him flatly that she did not need a repairman inventing problems as an excuse to insert himself into her life. Ryan nodded, accepting the rebuke without pushing further, though the sound stayed with him as she wheeled toward the elevator. Jason watched the exchange with a faint, private smile that Ryan did not miss, the kind of expression a man wears when something is going exactly according to plan. The elevator doors closed on Madison's retreating figure, the wheelchair catching once, almost imperceptibly, on the threshold, and Ryan stood in the lobby a moment longer than he needed to, turning the sound over in his mind like a puzzle piece that did not belong to the picture everyone else was seeing. The boardroom on the top floor was already full by the time Madison arrived, the long table lined with faces that had learned to look sympathetic while calculating profit. Jason sat near the head of the table beside Abigail Stone, the head of communications, who had a slideshow already prepared and waiting. Madison took her place at the head of the table, the wheelchair sliding into the gap left for her, and folded her hands, waiting for whatever performance had been arranged. Abigail opened with a proposal dressed up as concern. She suggested that Madison step back from daily operations and instead become the public face of the company, an inspiring figure for advertisements and interviews, while someone else handled the actual running of Reed Mobility. It was framed as protection, as a kindness, but Madison heard the truth underneath it immediately. They wanted to turn her into a harmless symbol while quietly moving real power into other hands. Jason added that shareholders were nervous, that recent press coverage focused too heavily on her health and appearance rather than her leadership, and that a change in structure might steady investor confidence. Madison answered him with a level voice that carried more heat than its surface suggested, telling the room that she had lost the use of her legs, not her ability to think or lead a company her father had built from a single garage. A murmur passed around the table, uncomfortable, unconvinced. One board member, an older man who had sat on the board since before the accident, mentioned an acquisition offer from a larger conglomerate, something Madison's father had refused twice before his death. She felt her stomach tighten at the suggestion, aware that selling the company would betray everything he had stood for, and aware too that Jason's calm insistence on the topic was not new. This was at least the third meeting where the sale had quietly resurfaced, always phrased as prudent business rather than surrender. Madison reminded the table, evenly but firmly, that her father had spent decades resisting exactly this kind of offer, believing the company existed to serve people who had nowhere else to turn, rather than to fatten a balance sheet for strangers. A few members nodded along, though she could not tell how many agreed out of genuine loyalty, and how many simply wished to avoid conflict in front of the room. Jason let the silence stretch just long enough to seem patient before steering the conversation back toward numbers, projections, and the language of responsible stewardship that always made retreat sound like wisdom. Outside the boardroom, Ryan had not yet left the building. A technician on the executive floor, overwhelmed with an automated door that kept jamming, had flagged him down for a quick opinion, and Ryan, unable to walk past a broken access system without looking, agreed to take a glance. While tracing the wiring behind the panel, he noticed something that had nothing to do with the door at all: a log of access attempts to the executive floor's security system, and one entry stood out immediately. Madison's credentials had been used late the previous night, at almost the exact hour she had been sitting alone at the gala across town. Ryan understood at once that the card had not simply been dropped and scratched by accident. It had been copied, used by someone else while its rightful owner was nowhere near the building. He reported the discrepancy to a security guard stationed near the elevators, but the guard barely looked up, having already been told by Jason earlier that morning to keep the maintenance contractor away from anything resembling internal business. The meeting inside ended with tempers still simmering, and Madison left the boardroom before the closing pleasantries were finished, anger sitting tightly behind her composed expression as she wheeled toward the lobby ramp. What none of them anticipated was the wheelchair catching hard at the edge of the sloped floor, the wheel locking without warning, threatening to tip her forward onto the marble. Ryan, still lingering near the door from his earlier detour, closed the distance in 2 long strides and caught the frame just before it went over, his hand steadying the chair a half-second before disaster. Madison's anger flared the instant she registered the hand on her chair, sharp and immediate, telling Ryan to let go before he had even finished steadying the frame. He released his grip at once, stepping back with both palms raised, apologizing quickly and explaining he had only wanted to keep her from falling. There was no defensiveness in his voice, only a plain, unhurried honesty, and something about the speed of his retreat. The fact that he did not linger or explain himself longer than necessary registered with her more than the catch itself had. She had spent 2 years surrounded by people who touched her chair without asking, who steered her through doorways she had not requested help with, who mistook control for kindness. Ryan was different in a way she could not immediately name, careful with boundaries even in a moment of near disaster. Once her breathing steadied, she allowed him to explain in full what he had noticed: the misaligned axle from the day before, the copied credentials used at an hour she had been nowhere near the building, the very real possibility that someone wanted an incident to happen in front of witnesses. Madison's first instinct was still suspicion. Too many people over the past 2 years had used her vulnerability as a doorway into her trust, and she told him plainly that his timing felt convenient. Ryan did not push back against her doubt. He told her briefly that he had once worked as a safety engineer for specialized vehicle systems before leaving the field to care for his family, and that whatever else was true about him, he could not look at a mechanical warning sign and pretend not to see it. He did not elaborate on his daughter, only that being a father had taught him silence was sometimes its own kind of harm. Reluctantly, Madison allowed him into a private technical room to examine the chair itself, making it clear this was not an invitation into her life, only a technical courtesy. Ryan knelt beside the frame and found what he had suspected: a single adjustment bolt replaced with a cheaper substitute, the kind of part that could fracture under sudden pressure at exactly the wrong moment. It was not the sort of component anyone but internal technicians should have ever touched. The color drained slightly from Madison's face as the implication settled. Only a small, trusted circle within Reed Mobility had access to her equipment for maintenance, a circle she had never once questioned. Ryan advised her carefully, choosing his words with the caution of someone who understood how fragile the moment was, that she should have the part examined by an outside legal advisor rather than report it through her own internal staff, at least until she understood who inside her own company could be trusted. Madison sat with that thought longer than she wanted to. She thought of Jason's calm insistence on the acquisition, of Abigail's slideshow dressed up as concern, of the quiet control that had crept into every corner of her company since the accident that took her legs. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she picked up her phone not to defend herself to the board, but to call Diana West, her personal attorney, and say words she had never let herself say aloud before, that perhaps the accident that changed her life had not been an accident at all. 2 years earlier, Madison had been preparing to launch a line of intelligent mobility vehicles designed to transport patients safely between medical facilities, a product she believed could change the trajectory of her company and, more privately, prove something to the industry that had never quite taken a young female founder seriously. Against the advice of nearly everyone around her, she insisted on testing an early prototype herself, certain that no demonstration would carry more weight than her own body inside the vehicle. Logan Bennett, her fiancé at the time, had urged her to let someone else run the test, telling her the company had engineers for exactly this purpose. Madison trusted her team completely and dismissed his concern as unnecessary caution. On the morning of the trial run, the braking system failed without warning on a closed test track, the vehicle losing control at a speed that should have been survivable, and it was not until she woke in a hospital bed days later that she learned she would never walk again. Logan stayed by her side through the earliest and darkest weeks, but as the reality of her new life settled in, so did his distance. He eventually told her, in a conversation she still remembered word for word, that the pressure had become too much for him to carry, and he left before her first month of recovery had ended. Jason stepped in to run daily operations while she healed, a gesture she had once been grateful for without question. The official investigation into the crash concluded that it had been an unavoidable mechanical failure, a conclusion Madison had no choice but to accept at the time, since grief and physical therapy left little room to challenge an official report backed by engineers she still believed she could trust. Returning to the present, Diana explained that several documents connected to the crash investigation had either gone missing over the years or been sealed under unusual circumstances that did not match standard procedure. Ryan listened to the account with a growing sense that something in the story did not follow ordinary mechanical logic. He pointed out that if the brake failure had truly been a natural malfunction, the vehicle's onboard safety system should have recorded detailed warning data in the moments leading up to the crash, the kind of information investigators always relied on in cases involving vehicle safety systems. Madison admitted almost reluctantly that the black box data had been reported as corrupted immediately following the accident, a detail she had never questioned until this moment. Ryan suspected, though he did not say it outright yet, that someone had deliberately erased that data before any official investigation had the chance to examine it properly. The timing alone was troubling, corrupted data appearing at precisely the moment it would have mattered most. Diana promised to dig deeper into the archived files connected to the case, aware that the deeper she went, the more resistance she was likely to encounter from people who had spent 2 years believing the matter closed. By the end of the day, Diana surfaced an old internal email that had somehow survived the purge of records, a message from Jason requesting that the test vehicle be moved to a private garage the night before the scheduled trial, a request that had never been mentioned in any official account of the accident. It was a small detail on its own, easily explained away, but combined with everything else, it sat heavily in Madison's chest like the first loose thread of something much larger unraveling. Within days, Jason and Abigail began shaping a quieter kind of attack, one built from suggestion rather than accusation. After Madison openly opposed the acquisition in front of the board, whispers began circulating that she was emotionally unstable, unable to separate personal grief from sound business judgment. A gossip site published a photograph from the rooftop bar, Madison sitting alone by the window on the night of the gala, framed with a caption implying loneliness and fragility rather than resilience. Another photograph, taken from the lobby the day Ryan caught her chair before it tipped, had been cropped and recirculated to suggest something far different from what actually happened, painting Ryan as a stranger taking advantage of a vulnerable, disabled executive. Ryan found himself dragged into a narrative he had never asked to be part of, described online as an opportunist chasing money from a wealthy, wounded woman, a single father with nothing to lose and everything to gain. Madison felt something close to fury at the framing, not because the accusation embarrassed her, but because it proved, once again, that the public could not imagine her making a choice without needing rescue or protection first. She had spent 2 years being reduced to a symbol of tragedy, and now even her own decisions were being rewritten as manipulation by someone else. Ryan, sensing the damage his presence was causing her reputation, told her plainly that he would step away if that made things easier, that he did not want to become another burden added to her list. Madison surprised herself by telling him to stay. It was not, she made clear, because she needed saving. It was because he was the only person inside her orbit who had noticed the mechanical evidence everyone else had chosen to overlook, whether through carelessness or design. That distinction mattered enormously to her, the difference between a man who saw her as fragile and a man who simply refused to ignore a warning sign. With her blessing, Ryan began quietly investigating the private garage mentioned in Jason's old email, tracking down a name that still appeared on old maintenance records, a former technician named Owen Blake who had once worked directly for Reed Mobility before leaving the company shortly after the accident. Owen was hesitant at first, clearly uneasy about being found, but eventually admitted that in the aftermath of the crash, Several employees had been pressured into signing agreements promising silence about what they had seen. He confirmed that certain critical components on the test vehicle had been swapped out before investigators from outside the company were ever allowed near it, a detail that had never appeared in any official report. When Ryan carefully asked about Logan, Owen hesitated longer than before, finally admitting that Logan had been present at the private garage the night before the crash, a fact that had somehow never made its way into any account of the accident that Madison had ever heard. Ryan left the meeting with more questions than answers, aware that the pieces forming in his mind painted a picture far more deliberate than a simple tragic malfunction. As he pulled away from the garage that evening, a dark sedan fell into place behind him, matching his speed with an ease that felt anything but coincidental. It trailed him for several blocks through quiet streets before finally peeling away at an intersection, leaving Ryan gripping the wheel a little tighter, newly certain that whoever wanted the truth buried was now aware that someone had started digging. He called Diana from the car once the sedan had disappeared, his voice steadier than he felt, and relayed everything Owen had told him about the signed agreements and the swapped components. Diana listened without interrupting, then told him plainly that this kind of testimony, secondhand and unrecorded, would not hold up under scrutiny on its own, that they would need something harder, something that could not be dismissed as rumor or a disgruntled former employee settling old scores. Ryan understood the weight of what she was asking and knew exactly where he needed to look next. Ryan returned to Madison's private office late that night, long after the rest of the executive floor had gone dark. He laid out what he had learned so far, the swapped components, the missing black box data, the pressured silence among former staff, but hesitated when it came to Logan's name, unsure how much weight she could absorb in a single evening. Madison noticed the hesitation immediately and told him, in a voice that allowed no argument, that she would rather hear the whole truth badly than a gentle version of it. When Ryan finally said Logan had been at the garage the night before the crash, Madison went quiet for a long stretch, her eyes fixed somewhere past him, somewhere in the years she had spent trying not to think about this exact possibility. She told him, after the silence stretched long enough to feel unbearable, that the hardest part of the accident had never been losing the use of her legs. It was waking up and realizing that everyone around her now saw a broken version of the woman she used to be. She spoke of Logan without bitterness at first, only exhaustion, recalling how he used to say he loved her strength, her drive, the way she refused to slow down for anyone. After the crash, that same man had told her he missed the woman she used to be, as though the woman sitting in front of him now was some lesser substitute unworthy of the same devotion. Madison said the sentence that undid something in Ryan completely, that her loneliness had never come from people failing to find her beautiful, but from being remembered only for the version of herself that could still stand. Ryan understood, in that moment, exactly what his careless words on the rooftop had touched without meaning to. He apologized again, but this time without excuse, without softening the edges of what he had said that first night, simply acknowledging that he had, without knowing it, poured salt into a wound that had never properly healed. Madison's posture softened slightly, the practiced composure cracking just enough to let something more honest through. She admitted that she hated being pitied, but admitted too that she was tired of having to be strong in every single room she entered. In turn, Ryan told her briefly about his own marriage, how it had ended not with dramatic betrayal but with a slow withdrawal, his former wife stepping back once life stopped being easy and started demanding sacrifice neither of them had planned for. He did not dress it up as tragedy, only fact, a mirror held up beside her own experience of being left once circumstances changed. Between them settled something quieter than romance, a fragile, cautious trust neither of them had expected to find in a stranger from a rooftop bar. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a message arriving on Madison's phone, an official notice from the board demanding an emergency session. The subject line made her stomach drop before she even opened it fully, a formal vote scheduled to determine whether she remained fit to continue running the company her father had built. Ryan watched her expression shift from vulnerability back into something harder, something braced for battle, and understood that whatever fragile peace they had just found would have to wait until she survived what was coming for her next. Diana spent the following 2 days buried in legal filings, cross-referencing corporate records until she found something buried deep inside a folder labeled Routine Restructuring, a temporary share transfer agreement signed only days after the accident. Madison's signature sat at the bottom of the page, yet the timestamp on the document placed it during a window when hospital records confirmed she had still been under sedation following surgery, incapable of signing anything with informed consent. Logan's name appeared as the witnessing signature on that same document, a detail that struck Madison harder than she expected. Jason had used the agreement quietly over the following 2 years as leverage, holding voting authority in reserve in case Madison was ever formally declared unfit to lead the company, a contingency he had clearly hoped to activate the moment public pressure grew loud enough. Madison sat with the realization that Logan had not simply abandoned her when she was weakest. He may have helped sell her out at the exact same time. Ryan examined the scanned copy of the contract line by line and noticed something in the file's metadata that did not sit right. A printer timestamp that did not match the date the hospital had recorded for her surgery. It suggested the document itself had likely been created much later, then deliberately backdated to align with the story Jason needed it to tell. It was a small technical detail, easy to overlook, but paired with everything else it formed a clearer, uglier picture. Diana requested an emergency order to access the company's older archived storage systems, though she cautioned that courts would need firmer evidence before granting anything beyond a preliminary review. Ryan decided to return to the storage facility where the original test vehicle had reportedly been kept, now relocated to a secondary warehouse the company rarely used. Inside, half buried under tarps and unused equipment, he found the same vehicle from the crash, its frame still bearing the scars of that day 2 years earlier. Examining the brake assembly closely, he discovered that the backup brake line had been severed in a way that could not be explained by the crash itself, a clean, deliberate cut rather than the ragged damage caused by impact. Nearby, an old security camera still had its internal hard drive intact, never connected to the network, and therefore untouched by whatever purge had erased the rest of the digital trail. Ryan carefully removed the drive and reviewed grainy footage that showed 2 familiar figures standing beside the test vehicle the evening before the crash, unmistakably Logan and Jason together, alone in a garage that supposedly no one but engineers should have accessed. Before Ryan could leave with the footage secured, a security guard hired directly by Jason spotted him near the warehouse entrance and moved to intercept him. Ryan barely managed to slip the hard drive into his jacket before the guard reached him, forcing him back toward the storage room under the pretense of a routine check. The door swung shut and locked from the outside before Ryan fully understood what was happening. Moments later, smoke began curling from a corner near the electrical panel, the fire suppression system oddly silent, as though it had been deliberately disabled just before someone triggered a small contained blaze meant to look accidental. For a moment, Ryan simply stood still, listening to the guard's footsteps retreating down the corridor outside, the warehouse settling into a silence that felt far more deliberate than empty. He pressed a hand against the door and felt no give at all, the kind of resistance that came from a bolt thrown from the other side rather than a jammed latch. The smell of smoke reached him before he saw its source, clearly, thin and acrid, curling low along the ceiling in a way that told him whoever had planned this had wanted it to look like an accident rather than an attack. Trapped inside the storage room with smoke curling steadily from the corner, Ryan tried calling Madison, but the signal inside the warehouse was too weak to hold a connection, his message breaking apart into fragments before it finally pushed through. He searched the shelves for anything useful, prying at the locked door with a length of pipe while keeping the hard drive pressed protectively against his chest, aware that the footage inside it mattered more than his own discomfort in that moment. Madison received his broken message at her desk and felt something cold settle in her stomach immediately, understanding instinctively that Ryan was in real danger. Jason chose that exact moment to appear at her office door, reminding her gently that the emergency board session was starting soon and that she should not let herself be distracted by outside matters. Something about his calm insistence, his precise timing, told Madison that he knew far more about Ryan's situation than an innocent man would. Rather than panic, Madison turned to the one tool nobody in the building had thought to strip from her control, her executive access to the company's central security network. She pulled up the warehouse's systems remotely and found an active lockdown command issued from a secondary account long associated with Abigail, proof that the fire and the locked door were no accident of chance but a coordinated effort to remove Ryan from the picture entirely. Ignoring the assistant who urged her to wait for building security to handle it, Madison wheeled herself directly toward the central security control room, moving faster through the hallways than she had allowed herself to move in months. She overrode the electronic lock remotely, watching the warehouse schematic on her screen as the door indicator finally flipped from sealed to open, and she called Diana immediately afterward, instructing her to alert the fire department directly rather than routing the request through any internal office Jason might intercept or delay. Ryan pushed through the door the moment it released, smoke stinging his eyes, a light burn already forming across his forearm where he had brushed against a hot pipe while forcing his way free. But the hard drive remained secure inside his jacket, undamaged and intact. When Madison reached the warehouse entrance minutes later, she did not embrace him the way a rescued moment in a film might demand. She simply looked at him for a long, steady beat and told him, quietly, that he had taken far too great a risk for evidence that was not his fight to carry. Ryan answered that this time he had not acted out of pity or obligation, only because the truth deserved to survive the night intact. Madison studied him for a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, before she straightened in her chair and made a decision she had been circling for hours. She would attend the emergency board session after all, not to plead for her position, not to defend her fitness to lead, but to dismantle, piece by piece, the entire scheme that had been built quietly around her for 2 years. Diana met them both in the lobby with a folder thick enough to answer every question the board intended to ask, and together the three of them walked toward the elevator that would carry them up to the very room where Jason had once assumed her downfall was already guaranteed. When the doors of the boardroom finally opened, Madison rolled forward first, spine straight, jaw set, with Ryan and Diana following close behind her, while across the table Jason allowed himself the faint, satisfied smile of a man who still believed, in that final moment, that he had already won. The boardroom was full when Madison entered, every major shareholder present along with the company's outside counsel and a handful of internal staff invited to witness what everyone assumed would be a formality. Jason opened the session with a carefully rehearsed speech, his tone gentle and concerned, suggesting that Madison needed rest and that the company required steadier leadership during a difficult stretch. Abigail followed with a slideshow of damaging headlines, arguing that public perception of Madison had become a liability threatening the company's valuation. Madison listened without interrupting, her hands folded calmly on the table, letting them finish every carefully constructed word before responding. When her turn came, she did not attempt to prove she deserved sympathy or admiration. Instead, she asked the room to look only at the facts laid before them, nothing more, nothing less. Diana stood and presented the share transfer agreement, highlighting the impossible timestamp that placed Madison's signature during a period when she had been unconscious following surgery, a detail hospital records confirmed without ambiguity. Ryan spoke next, his voice steady despite the faint bandage still wrapped around his forearm, explaining in plain, accessible language how the brake system had been tampered with and how the vehicle's onboard warning data had conveniently vanished in the immediate aftermath of the crash. The recovered security footage was played for the room, silent but damning, showing Logan and Jason standing together beside the test vehicle the night before it failed. Jason attempted to dismiss Ryan as an outsider with no standing to offer testimony in a corporate matter of this weight. Madison answered him directly, her voice carrying clearly across the long table, saying that Ryan needed no formal standing to speak an obvious truth, while Jason had used his very real standing as chief operating officer to bury a crime for 2 years. Logan was patched into the meeting through a video call arranged earlier that morning, his face pale and uncertain on the screen the moment he realized what was being presented. He denied everything at first, his voice thin and unconvincing, until Diana produced a record of a wire transfer routed through a shell company tied directly back to accounts he controlled. Abigail attempted to slip out of the room quietly once the tone shifted decisively against them, but security stationed at the door, arranged in advance through Diana's legal request, stopped her before she reached the hallway. The board, faced with documentation impossible to explain away, moved swiftly to suspend Jason from his position immediately, halt the pending acquisition entirely, and formally refer the entire matter to outside investigators for further review. Shareholders who had arrived prepared to vote Madison out of leadership left instead, demanding a full independent audit of everything Jason had touched over the past 2 years. As the meeting dissolved into hurried side conversations and urgent phone calls, Madison remained still at the head of the table, watching Jason as security quietly escorted him toward the door. She told him, in a voice too calm to be mistaken for triumph, that he had not managed to defeat her with an accident 2 years earlier, and he certainly would not manage it now with 2 years of carefully engineered pity dressed up as concern. Jason said nothing in response, his composure finally cracking as he was led out past the same shareholders who had once trusted him completely. Ryan stood quietly near the back of the room throughout the aftermath, watching Madison hold her ground in a way that made it clear she had never actually needed rescuing, only someone willing to notice what everyone else had chosen to overlook. Diana began gathering documents for the investigators who would arrive within the hour, and the room slowly emptied of everyone except the small handful of people who had actually told the truth from the very beginning. One of the older shareholders lingered by the door, catching Madison's eye before he left, and told her quietly that her father would have been proud of how she handled the room, not because she had won, but because she had refused to make the fight about anything other than the truth. Madison thanked him, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks, and watched the last of the chairs empty out until only Ryan and Diana remained beside her at the long table, where only an hour earlier her entire future had hung in the balance. In the weeks that followed, Madison reclaimed full control of Reed Mobility, though she never mistook the outcome for an easy victory. Investigators combed through years of records, the company weathered a fresh wave of press attention, and Madison had to sit with the harder truth that the man she once planned to marry had helped bury the worst moment of her life for his own gain. Ryan considered stepping back entirely, worried that his continued presence would only feed another round of distorted headlines about her private life. Instead, he found her one evening at the same rooftop bar where they had first spoken, standing by the same window overlooking the same stretch of city lights. This time, he did not reach for an easy compliment. He told her simply that she had never needed anyone to prove her worth for her, that she had already spent 2 years proving it alone under circumstances that would have broken most people completely. Madison admitted that his very first words to her had cut somewhere raw and unhealed, but that the fact he stayed once he understood exactly where that wound lived was what had ultimately earned her trust. Ryan acknowledged that he had learned something important through all of it, that loneliness did not disappear because of a single kind sentence, but because someone was patient enough to keep showing up long after the flattery wore off. Madison proposed, almost businesslike at first, that they build an independent safety division within the company, one designed specifically to prevent exactly the kind of quiet sabotage that had nearly cost her everything. Ryan agreed without hesitation, recognizing in the offer not charity but genuine partnership. What grew between them afterward unfolded slowly and carefully, not the story of a man swooping in to rescue a broken woman, but two people who had each been abandoned before, learning gradually how to trust again without either one performing strength they did not actually feel. His daughter was mentioned only briefly near the very end, a quiet aside about how Ryan hoped she would grow up understanding that nobody should ever be pitied simply for being different from everyone around them. The final image lingered on Madison at the same window, no longer sitting there because she had been left behind by anyone, but because she had chosen this particular piece for herself on her own terms, for the first time in years. Ryan had once believed she was too pretty to be alone. By the end of everything, he understood the deeper truth beneath that clumsy first sentence, that she was far too strong to ever belong to anyone who only loved her while she was still standing. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that strength never expires, no matter what life takes away.